All right, guys. I believe it's time we finish up with animation. I just wanted to go over everything we've done so far and just you know give it a bit of an overview, just like what I've done with the modeling bit, but here with an animation setup. Throughout the course of these several videos, I've created several animations. As you can see here, I even have the UVs ready for the next video in order to explain to you how this thing works. But before we go into the UVs, I just wanted to go over just so that you don't get confused or, there's been a lot of stuff being talked about, but in reality, it's a very simple process, very simple workflow in terms of at least animating stuff, okay? So let's go ahead and start with the hardest one that we've done because I think I may have stacked a little bit too many ways to approach something. Let's go ahead and start with our arrow that transforms itself into an exclamation mark. So here are the morphs that we used, and basically what I did, and obviously remember the morphing targets is part of the animation workflow, and you will have to use them at some point or another. The most important thing is that whenever you want to be creating a blend shape, it needs to have the exact same vertex count. Okay, it means that not just even an exact same vertex count, but a very similar topology. Because otherwise, basically, Maya, what you're saying is, I want this to turn into something else, but in order to do that, Maya needs to know which vertex goes where, and in order for that to happen, you need to have the exact same vertex over here. So if you were to squash this, and let's say that this is my new blend shape, right? It's entirely possible to have a blend shape like that, The only difference is that Maya will know, okay, so this front vertex is going to go down here, right? But this is a simple transform, right? So you could say that you don't really need a blend shape for this, but it's exactly the same process for a more complicated shape. And as you can see here, in order to do that, instead of just having my arrow and then just trying to turn it into a question mark, sorry, an exclamation mark, I simply shrink wrapped it. Okay, and this is my target now. Notice that they look identical, but this is obviously, you shouldn't do that. All right, this is a very ugly looking thing in terms of really everything, but it will get the job done for our case. Obviously, you never import something like that in a game. All right, you don't want to be like, this is a very expensive question mark. Anyway, although if you don't care about resources, just want to make a game and then just optimize, sure. Right, back to reality. What I was going to say is that these are our morph targets. We don't really use them. Now, we could technically modify this, and, if we modify this, we will change the outcome of our arrow, right? So I'm going to hide these for now. I'm going to open up the main arrow setup here. Okay. Now, remember, we have a deformer as well here. So the deformer bit is also keyable. Remember that anything you can move, with very few exceptions, anything in Maya can be keyed to an animation. That's why it's so powerful, because anything you can do, anything you can see here, you can turn into an animation. It doesn't matter what it is. You can actually model and animate at the same time. Okay, so if you take a box, let's say you create a box and you decide to, out of this box, create something, you can actually animate almost every every aspect of whatever it is you're doing. Extrusions, actually, I don't know if you can keyframe extrusions. I think you can, right? But anyway, the point is that almost everything is keyable, which is very important when you make an animation, because you got to figure out what's the best way to achieve a certain move. Now, usually nonlinear deformers are your best bet, because unless of course you want to sculpt stuff. And that way you could also use blend shapes. The point is that deformers are very powerful tools, and you can keyframe them. If you take a look here at the squash, there is a keyframe, right? The input is a squash, and there's a key. Obviously, I should have put it at keyframe number 0, but at the time, I think the minimum, we started our video at keyframe 1. So there's the stage, but let's say you could just go ahead and move this over here. And we didn't have that many keyframes, by the way. I think we went from 1 to 15. That's something like that. But I'm not gonna change the range slider here just for this. And if you remember, we also had a driven key, right? And the driven key was the thing that was driving the morph. So in order for this to happen, we had to make sure that our object goes from an arrow into a into the target object. Remember, this is the target object. If we take a look over here, that's what it is. This is the initial object here in the morphs that we saw. And in order to have this sphere pop up, I just basically shrink wrapped it around the arrow, and had a set driven key there as well. So basically both of these things are set driven, and to be fair, it's exactly the same process. If you remember correctly, the same thing I did for the arrow, I did for the ball, essentially. Now, this is not the best way to do it. There's definitely better ways to do it, but it was just an example where I could cram in a blend shape, a driven key, a keyframe, and a shrink wrap, and a deformer, right? So I basically tried to put everything in. Maybe that's why it may have been a little bit too confusing. But if you remember correctly, you've got this exclamation blend, which is keyframed, right? You can see that it's keyframed. It's not on this it's not on this frame, but there we go, it's frame 15. So this is my driven key, remember? Okay, so this is a driven key. There's another one as well where you can take a look. I think, where was squash? No, where'd it go? Dot blend. So I have a dot blend as well, but it is actually not keyframed because it is tied to other things. And if we go ahead and open the set driven key menu now, we'll actually see what it's been tied to, right? But it does the same thing. It's just that it's hooked up to the Translate Z, I believe, right? And you can always open your your general editors and go into your hierarchy of connections in the hypergraph and just take a look there. Not to mention that you also have the ability to go into the graph editor and further modify your animation. If you remember correctly, we had an animation on a few vertices over here, and while generally this is not the best idea, you don't want to animate without having a selection set, especially if you're animating vertices. Focus, goddammit. If you have vertices like this and they move, this is something you really don't want, because right now, remember, I did this with soft select. So if I go ahead into vertex mode right now, I will not find for the life of me where these vertices are. Like, which one did I animate? Look at how many there are, right? These are a lot of vertices. So I did this hastily, and obviously this is a mistake. You don't want to do that. You want to have a selection set. So, whenever you just right click over an item, and you can have, I believe, color sets, UV sets, actions. Where are the freaking selection sets? I believe it's actually possible to create a selection set, modify. It was somewhere here anyway. You can find it. There we go. Select, and then you have your selection sets. Jeez, where are they? Quick select sets. There you go. So you need to define select sets, and then in this case, if you had them, you will actually go here and select them from here. I believe there was one. I think it's a create one, measuring tools, sets. There you go. So you got quick select set, or a particular difference set, or partition set. All these sets are available so that you can actually grab them. Now, another option to go ahead and take a look at what we've done here is to go ahead and take a look at the dope sheet. Obviously, currently it's empty, but if we select our object, and let's say we select these vertices over here, we can take a look at which ones are keyed. But damn it, if there is a lot of keys. I mean, look at a lot of vertices selected. So this doesn't really help us. But we do know that some of them are actually part of the keyframe, and there you are. There's 1, 2, 3. There's a bunch of vertices that we have here. Well, actually more than a few. So we have definitely a lot of vertices that are being keyframed in. It's also possible to just select the whole object and then just drill down. Currently, if I just frame all, there you go. So currently we've got 2 keyframes, right? And we can go up further down into the arrow shape. And the arrow shape is where all the magic happens. Usually you've got all the envelopes for the expand, the squash. Remember the deformer here, so you can actually see it here. Not to mention that if you so desire, obviously you can move these around left and right, and you can change their value if you so desire. But you could also go into the graph editor and do so unequivocally. You can do, basically you can change the transform here on a particular object. So currently we've got something that goes from the first frame to frame 15. I'm going to select this object. So what do we have? The arrow shape. This is our whole object here. So the arrow shape is moving in the z-axis here. I think I moved it. Notice that I'm moving it up and down the z-axis, and that's exactly what's happening. What's going on right now. And because it's blue, the blue represents the Z, which is up in our case. Green represents the Y, and X is obviously red. Okay, so you've got loads of these things. Now, notice, by the way, that you have not only you have two of these, but that some of these vertices, they have flat keys. They have 0 keys. There's nothing in it. Now, you can easily delete those because we haven't actually animated them in particular. Because, like I said, this was just an example. This is a very bad sort of animation style. And I believe in newer versions or in scripts, as well as when you're baking stuff, like when you go into key and you basically go ahead and bake your animation, you can actually delete. I believe there was a way to delete empty keys. There was something like that, or maybe it was in the features of the new Maya. I'm not sure. I think I've seen it somewhere, but you'll find it yourself when it comes to these, because like I said, you probably won't be having these empty keys, too many of these empty keys, because you will not be making just empty keyframes like this. Okay, you do want to avoid this, because notice how much stuff do I have here, and only here do I finally have my driven key. This is my driven key. Exclamation blend body, and now I can take a look and see what my value is and how fast I blend between these. Right, so this is my blend, starts from 5 to 15. Before that, I have the squash, right, which is my regular squash over here. I'm not moving the object here. Not to mention, by the way, that because I'm currently morphing into the local transform of my target, in the world transform of my target, I should probably make it so that it's local. In other words, this is also wrong. What I'm currently doing is because in the morphs, as you can see here, my morph is all the way up here, and what's going to happen is that my target is going to go all the way up to the morph, right? But this means that if I move the morph, this will also move my target, which is not what you want. You just want to use the shape. You don't want to use the transform usually. So you would go ahead and disable the, change the reference type in the driven keys bit. In the blend shapes bit. And you can also obviously go ahead into these editors over here, and you've got these shape editors and all of them jazzes. So you can definitely go ahead and play around with that. Okay. Now, that being said, you can also use the time editor to have a non-destructible type workflow, where I'm not exactly sure how this case will work, because this is a very bad example. As in, you can't really reuse these clips on, unlike the hand, which I showed you with the combo and all that, you can't actually reuse these clips on anything other than an object that is exactly the same, because we have vertex animation here, and yeah, you have deformers, but in general, this is best used for a rigged model. Okay, that's not to say that you can't use it on vertex animation such as this, but in general, I try to stay away from it when it comes to vertex animations, because they're usually simple enough and they don't need to be reused in many cases. The reason the rigging and skeleton thing was invented is because you want to reuse a lot of animations, whereas here, if you want to reuse something, you would probably create a rig for it. Now, you can play around with this and see what you've got, depending what you have. Maybe if you had if you duplicate this, right, and do something with it, you could definitely find a use for it. But in reality, it really depends on what object you have and what kind of animation you've got. Okay. And one final thing, by the way, is that even though you can't reuse it, it's also useful to actually add the animation here, so you can probably so that you can just use the workflow that's available to you instead of the old one where you have an animation set here and you have different morphs. So for example, you could have different layers with different morph targets, where in the first case your arrow turns into an exclamation mark, but in the second case it actually morphs into a question mark. So you'd need two layers here, and you could do the same thing in the time editor without actually having drastic changes to your animation. This is a non-destructive workflow, something that you really need to adopt if you want to save yourself some time in the future. That being said, we no longer need the this particular animation. We can go to the extra, which is our boomerang, and if you remember correctly, our boomerang also had a particularly interesting setup here, because, excuse me, it was flying. Right? We set up the flight. If I remember correctly, oh my God, I deleted the path. I'm sorry. Okay, well, you know, we're gonna have to skip over this because I'm not gonna go ahead and animate this again. But essentially, we went over the curve. You could use a curve as a path, and you could use also, you can visualize your keyframes if you had any. Okay, I'm gonna do this real quick. So if we go ahead and set a key over here in the translate, say, I don't know, Shift W0, and then go to key number 65, and this would be over here, and I would set it up as well, and I probably should just turn on the auto key, and then I'm gonna go back to 0, and I'm gonna go over here and set the rotation to be 0, and over here to set the rotation to be which way am I rotating now? Okay, across the z-axis, so I don't know, 3600. So now I've had this done, and I can set it, and it's been set. So currently, actually, I don't even need these. So currently, I have a bunch of rotations, but nothing really happens. And if I go ahead now and I visualize, I'm going to exit this. If I go now and I visualize and I create an editable motion trail, I can actually start inserting keys over here so that we can start to work with something, right? So if I actually select this, it'd be nice. So you can modify the keys, and you can start inserting keys in here. And let's say there's my key, so I want my key to move over here. So this is my final thing. I actually almost nailed the my trajectory here. So this allows you to have a more realistic sort of more visualized type of modification. But in reality, it's not much different than a curve. Difference being, however, is that you could use this in an already established animation. A curve, you already have to know what you're doing. For example, like a fist or a punch or that sort of deal. You could also, like, this is always very handy whenever you have motion of many bodies. All right. Also, don't forget you've got these little options here, like the tangents. Remember the tangents. You can go ahead into the graph editor and see what different tangents, you know, what kind of effects they have. You can have steps or regular tangents or just you know, linear. Just press A to fit everything in there, and then if you take a look here, we've got the rotation, which goes from 0 to what is this currently, as you can see, something like 3600. We've got the translate, which goes from 0 to something very low. Well, actually, we're not using the X, we're using the Y, I believe. Yeah, we're using the Y, and as you can see, it's a very small one. So you can use the different views here. Obviously, you could also focus 1 to 3 to go ahead and see what exactly you're looking at. So my translate goes from 0 to 30, right? Same thing goes over here. You can notice that the keyframes, they're different colors. One keyframe, when it's yellow, it's basically being driven by something. When it's red, it's being keyframed to the frame over, sorry, to the time slider. When it's blue, it's being driven by another attribute, which is actually which is not tied in. It's not like a driven key. We actually have a driven key to move, but it's an attribute that moves on its own. Okay, how should I explain this? If you tie a particular movement to X and you have control over X, you can key X, and therefore you will have keyed the whatever it is you tied to X, right? And that's when you have a yellow type deal, and you can keyframe that. It's going to turn red. When you have something that is blue, such as the case here, I'm going to hide this because I'm not going to need this, and I'm going to delete this. Actually, I need to exit all of this and select this and delete it. If I go ahead and go into main, and again, I just want to go and show you what I mean. Over here in the dot blend, notice that my exclamation dot target is blue, all right, versus my exclamation blend, which is yellow. And remember the key, which is red. And the keys, the set driven keys are usually yellow, right? Unless they changed it and I missed it. In which case, what's going to happen if I go ahead and delete this keyframe? Nothing. Okay. For For some reason, this is not the way it's supposed to. It's supposed to be keyframe, but then again, it's not in the channel box. But anyway, refresher colors. Basically, red means it's tied to a particular frame. Yellow means you have very little control of it, or it's driven. And blue means it's driven, but you don't have control over the driven key. All right, unless they changed it or I misunderstood it. It's not that big of a deal, to be honest. You'll get to gripes with it as you use them. Okay. Anyway. The next, we've got the hand. Here we went over the particular uses that we have in, with the time editor. And the time editor, like I said, is a very powerful thing. Here, I'm not going to go ahead and just load everything up right now because, like I said, I've already spent a ridiculous amount of time explaining how this whole thing works. But basically, what you do is either import from external files, or you go, as you can see here, I got the whole full combo. I believe currently it's been mapped, so I've got. No, I don't have the whole thing. Well, I can just import this and grab the final combo, for example. And now if I play this, my animation is being driven by, well, actually, I'm lacking, oh, crap. Okay, this also sometimes happens. So just, don't get too worried about it. It just, just usually happens. When you try to perform undos when you're not supposed to be doing them. So let me go ahead and just open this up again. So here I had a separate scene for this, just because I didn't want to get in the way into the worm. Where was I? There's the hand. So let's go ahead and see if we maybe need more than these frames. Go to 200. Maybe I just needed more frames to see the full animation. There's 1, 2, 3. No. So we need to import it. So let's go ahead and import this. And there's my final combo. And now, actually, I should probably move this down to 0. And this as well. And now if I go ahead and play this, you've got the full combo in the slider. Seriously, dude? Am I really going to have to do this? Go on. 1, 2, 3. Where's the full combo? Oh, I see. Okay, actually, I need to get rid of these controllers, I believe, because they basically control my object right now, unfortunately. Anyway, my point is that the time editor is a useful tool. Obviously, not in this case because I have my controls tied up. But like, let's say I delete them. If I delete these controls and I delete everything, and I delete my well, I shouldn't have deleted my IK frame. IK for sure. Don't want to delete the IK, but I delete these. Can I delete the control, please? Delete the control. Is this a circle? This is my object. Okay, as you can see, well, basically, this is what you would see if I delete the control. For some reason, if I delete this, it also ends up deleting my. Or does it? Yeah, for some reason, it also ends up deleting my controls, which is not what I want. Maybe I just bugged something out when Maya crashed, or I'm just missing something right now. It doesn't matter for this case. I just wanted to show you that depending on what you use, try to try basically different methods of operation, and you have many different options. Whenever you export something, make sure to bake it as well. Because in this case, obviously, it's baked. It means that I can actually go ahead and perform, even though I can perform edits on this, it's a big mess, right? So you always want to have your original animation backed up in a way that, it's not destroyed. You can definitely simplify simplify curves, and it will delete keys where it doesn't need them, but it's not a perfect situation. And, really, you want to have your animation done and dusted before you bake it anyway. You don't want to be exporting crappy animation unless it's just for not benchmarking, but for like testing stuff, right? So make sure you do that. Okay, that's actually it. I think I'm really disappointed about the hand. I really wanted to see this combo again. So what's gonna happen if I delete this whole thing? And now, yeah, there we go. So I deleted the drivers. I actually forgot that I didn't have my IK animated. So yeah, once you have a baked animation, you don't need any of that jazz, right? So here's your full bitch slapping animation that we had. My point is that I can actually go ahead and import this and add it to another character. Actually add it to some character's hand, by the way. Notice that I've only animated the hand, but if I had a camera here, right? If I had a camera, something like this. Let's say this is what the player would see. I'm going to hide this. Imagine that this is a player's perspective, right? And they're going to see this. Now, obviously, this is not that good, but imagine if you had if you've created your animations with this in mind. You could obviously specify how big your hand is, how far away it goes, so you can have these different punches, etc. And if it's a character that you've made, these are animations that are perfectly valid. Even if you have more bones than these three, even if you have middle bones here for your wrist and your forearm, and so that it doesn't deform unnaturally, which most people just don't bother unless they're, you know, it's a really AAA high tech type deal, because you need to half the rotation here. But what I'm saying is that you can reuse these animations very easily, and it's a very powerful tool. So I recommend you learn to use it. Okay, last thing on the list is basically the whole animation workflow, because I wanted just to make sure that you understand how this all works. Okay, now first you go ahead and you create your object. Okay, then you model your object. Okay, then you obviously, before you start doing any major things, you delete the history on an object. So if you do a couple of extrudes, let's say if I go ahead and grab this face and I extrude it, right? If I grab it and extrude it, right, and then I extrude again, but like inwards and scale in like this, right? And then I do something fancy like, oh, I don't know, grab a couple of edges maybe, right? These edges over here, and maybe just add a couple of them to the selection. This is, I don't even know what I'm doing right now, but I don't know, let's say I go to edit mesh and I just go ahead and I don't know, bevel it, right? So there's something like this, but then I got all these problems here. But anyway, let's say this is an ashtray. All right, for some, I don't even know how I arrived to this at this thing, but like imagine this is an ashtray, and this is what I've done. Now I want to animate it. Maybe I want it to be like like some weird ashtray, like a talking ashtray, right? So this would be the mouth, right? I would go ahead and split the edges here, and maybe not so drastically, right? Drag it down. Use your transforms over here, so you can say the transform constraints you want it to be a surface slide or an edge slide. You slide it down, and there's your mouth, right? So then you delete these bits here, you know, like these faces here, right? And you start animating. For example, you can use this as a pivot points. But anyway, the point is you have your geometry ready, and now if you notice here, I've got my inputs. Now what I'm going to do is delete the history, Alt-Shift-D. Now this deletes the whole history. If you have deformers, you do not delete the whole history. Remember, right? You go into edit, and then you go delete all by type, delete history. I deleted all of the history. I probably need to add a control, like an Alt-Control-Shift-D for non-deformer history, which is very nice. And this is exactly what I'm going to do, actually. Let me go ahead and see here. I've got my hotkey editor. Always try to work with your, like, whenever you're, basically the best way you think it is. So delete non-deformer history. Okay, non-deformer history. So delete by type, non-deformer history, and then you can obviously do it with options. So I'm going to go ahead and Control Shift Alt D. So Control Shift and Alt and D, and save that. So from now on, if I want to delete just the non-deformer history, I just mash my hand on the keyboard, and eventually it'll get deleted, right? Anyway, so notice that my shape is now complete. I don't have any more options here, right? I will zero it out. So you go up, and let's say in this case you want to have your pivot to be somewhere here at the bottom. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't have a snap the way Unreal Engine has, where you can just snap a particular pivot at a particular point, right? So let's say you hold down Shift, but this will only orient it. Maybe if you have different snaps, you hold down J, but this is a very big snap, so you know you have to set it up in such a way that you get it to a particular point. Right? Maybe I would need to add a like if I exit this, right, and I go ahead into my multi-cut tool, and then I just add like 2 of these, and this way I have a center, right? And I probably just delete these after all anyway, but let's say I have my edges here, and then I go ahead and grab a pivot. Where is it? Grab the pivot and just vertex snap it to the bottom of my object, okay? And then I go ahead and snap it to the center of the grid. So now my object is centered. All I need to do now is center the pivot, freeze the transforms, if I can actually freeze them, there we go, and then delete the history. The non-deformer history or the regular history, whichever way. So now I got deleted history, clean transforms, centered pivot, although in this case probably not the best idea, because if I'm gonna put this in a game, I want my pivot to be somewhere at the bottom, because it's gonna be on the floor, right? Otherwise I'm gonna have to be eyeballing it so that it touches the floor. So in this case, this is not the best way to have the pivot baked, but you know, that's later down the line. And now that you have that, you would do the UVs first. And that's why we're going to talk about the UVs in the next video, because you want to have your UVs done after your whole animation is before you start animating and rigging. Now in this case, I would probably rig this, right? So I would do the UVs, which we're going to talk in the next video. Then I'm going to rig it, right? And then I'm going to use the control vertices, control surfaces or whatever, like control curves, to make a rig out of it. Then paint the skin weights. Well, probably first I'm gonna rig it, then paint the skin weights. Sorry, rig it, control rig, and then paint the skin weights once I bind it to the mesh. Then after you animate it, you basically go ahead and fill up all of your keyframes that you have set up here for whatever it is you're doing. And then you're ready to export. Before you do that, you need to bake it and make sure to export every single animation in a separate FBX file so that it is reusable. Okay, now I hope this wasn't for too long, too long of a process. So let me just go over it one more time. Okay, very simple. So you can actually even write this down if you want. Here's the workflow. Create a model. Right, create a model in any way you want. It could be NURBS, it could be curves, lofting, right, from the NURBS, or you could have sculpting, right, anything, polygon modeling, whatever floats your boat. So you create the model. Afterwards, you make the UVs for this model, okay? Before you do that, you have your model all set up, right? So you've done the UVs, you've done all that. Then you go ahead and freeze the transforms, delete everything, make sure it's a static, like it's a completely fresh object, right? There's no history on it, unless you have deformers, in which case, obviously, you keep the deformers on, which you probably won't need if you're static modeling. So you usually use deformers when you're animating already. Okay, model deformers are whenever you're happy with the shape you have, just delete everything and then set up new deformers if you have to, unless it's like it's situational. Now after you do that, you go ahead and make the UVs. After you do that, you go ahead and create your rig. After you do that, you create the control rig. And after you do that, you bind the rig to the mesh, okay, and you paint your weights. After that, you start animating, obviously in this case for the rig. So you animate your control curves, which in turn transfer motion to the rig. Once you're done, you select the rig, select the whole rig like the hierarchy, without all the control curves, and you bake all of this information in for every frame onto the skeleton. You export this as a separate FBX file for every single clip. So you have a game exporter over here. Well, this is not the game exporter. Where is it? You go into a game exporter, depending on when you use animation clips over here from your graph editor or your time editor. You export separate clips, or maybe if you want, you can have a full combo, whatever. Point is, you export these things so you can use them later down the line in your engine, instead of just every time you import, be like, oh, which frame was that? Which frame was that? Right? So you use that, and after that, after you've done all of this, you have a animation set. Okay. And you can have different animation sets as much as you want, like it's part of the, the time editor here. Okay, well, and you can obviously use layers in between and all that jazz as I've shown you, but the workflow is as I've just told you, right? Fairly simple. Obviously, if you're not using a skeleton, you don't need to go ahead and do the whole skeleton bit. You can start animating immediately. Let's say If I were to use an example, it'd be for vertex animation, it'd be stuff that is only a one-shot thing. So if you were to reload a gun, you would probably need to go ahead and have a some kind of a skeleton that holds the actual clip, but you wouldn't need a rig on the gun, although there's nothing stopping you from having that. For example, if the gun is shooting and the slide goes back and forth, now this could be a very simple vertex animation, right? Because you've got a slide, you can select the slide and just move all the faces backwards, and there's your animation. You can also go a step further and actually have two bones, right? And both these bones go back and forth, and there's your animation there, but it's a little bit too expensive in this case. So depending on what you've got, you want to be using the appropriate animation set. Obviously, if you got something that squishes, deforms, like a ball, right? A bouncing ball, yeah, you want to have your little deformers that squish it and stretch it. If you have like a pogo stick, right, or like a spring, right? You use deformers for that. You don't need bones, although, like I said, nothing's stopping you. But it's just, you know, whichever one is easier in the case that I'm talking about, right? So that's it, guys. That's it from me. Just make sure to understand that the workflow is very important. And in the next video, we'll be talking about UVs. Actually, I'm not even going to delete this. I'm going to add this to the extras because I actually kind of like this. Like, it was very weird. I never actually done an ashtray before. Never had to. So there's that. Oh, by the way, always remember that you can not only save your scene, right, with Control S, but you can also save and increment save. So it gives you versions. It's like autosave, but it is more controlled autosave. So it's like, yeah, I want a new version of this now, and that's what it's going to be. I believe it's going to go back into your autosaves folder with your increments. Right, I'll see you in the next video when we start talking about UVs, and I need to change this color, and I probably will before we do that, okay? So I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.